Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is a packed house, actually, which is fantastic. Thank you all for coming. This event is being streamed live over the internet, so we're expecting at least 500,000 or millions of people to be watching this live on TV. Of course, it's been recorded, so it will be available on the website afterwards. So this is kind of a different sort of event to what you normally go to. The structure of this is like BBC Question Time that you get on a Thursday evening. I'm a Dimbleby for tonight. But we do have an expert panel here, which will be answering a set of questions which have been sent in by you guys when you registered. So I will ask you to stand up and no, I should just ask you to read out your question when it's your turn, and we'll go through and get the panelists to answer. So before we start, what I'd like to say is this is about the future of road transport in terms of electrification, electric vehicles. Obviously, there's a huge amount of technology that is being developed by a lot of companies to make that happen, and it's about what the vision is of how that rollout is going to happen. So your questions will hopefully illuminate that. So what we'll do is we'll go through the panelists and get them just to say 1 or 2 seconds about who they are. My name's Professor Phil Morby. I'm here at the University of Warwick. I'm one of the co-leads of the Energy GRP, Global Research Priority, and my particular expertise is in the area of power electronics. Of course, in any electric vehicle, there are 3 important components. There's the battery, the store of energy. There's the electric motor, the thing that makes it move, and the power electronics in the middle. Of course, outside the vehicle, there's a whole load of infrastructure besides which is on board the car, and of course, there's quite a lot of questions about that this evening. So we'll go along in this order.
My name's Colin Heron. As you can tell from the accent, I'm from the northeast of England. I started in the car industry in 1973. I worked for Nissan for 17 years. I was involved in the location of the battery plant and the facility to the northeast of England. I project managed 1,100 charging points in the northeast of England. And if you go into any service station and see a rapid charger, we project managed over 300 going in across the UK. So we look at the infrastructure, we look at the vehicle, we look at the training of the people to repair the vehicles, any technology at all off the vehicle, that's what we look into.
My name's Mark Thompson. I work for an organisation called Innovate UK, which is a government agency. We are the innovation agency for business for the UK. So we help businesses, particularly small businesses, develop new products and services. I'm an energy systems specialist, so I have a particular interest in helping innovators provide solutions to create a really efficient and really joined up and really positive experience for EV users, as well as helping electric vehicles become a real win for the energy system in providing ultimately solutions that lead to lower cost energy for both EV users and for homeowners as well. My original career many, many years ago was in the automotive sector as well. Like Colin, I used to work at Rolls-Royce, Bentley and Cruise, so I'm actually a petrol head underneath. But I've also got an EV, and I've been in the energy sector for about 7 years, all in the innovation space.
My name is James Marco. I'm an academic here at University of Warwick. I'm a reader sort of specialising in energy storage, and most of the research that I've been doing recently has been around sort of battery system control, battery systems, the integration into vehicles and grid.
I work for a company called A.T. Kearney, which is a management consultancy, but I specialise in electric vehicles. In particular, smart charging, which is managing the use of those vehicles effectively so that we don't consume too much energy during certain times of the day, which can impact the grid, and also vehicle to grid, which means that we can also discharge the battery back into the grid. I've worked quite closely with Warwick University as well to look at the impacts of that discharging on the vehicle battery.
I'm Tim Martin. I've spent many years developing new products in the automotive industry. Most of them, I'm sad to say, dirty products. And then I got clean and developed a couple of all-electric vehicles, one of which was the Lightning supercar. And then I ran a project for Nissan to convert their little electric van into a London taxi. That project hit the buffers because there wasn't any charging infrastructure in London. I now run a company called Zap in a Mo, which you've all heard of, or you all will, and we will change the face of charging in Britain.
Okay, so thank you very much, panel. I hope you're ready to start with some of these questions. We've got a whole range of questions. Probably we'll try and get through them all in the 80, 90 minutes that we have available. And we'll start with the first one from Lee Juby. Lee.
Hi, I'm Dr. Lee Juby. I'm a fellow of the IET. It's generally accepted that we will switch to electric transportation. But considering the additional transportation demand for electricity, coupled with the vision of decarbonising energy through a switch to electric domestic heating, could the panel give their view on the UK ability to install enough power generation and T&D capacity in a timely manner? The medium-term continual practical need for a very efficient on-vehicle power generation solution.
Okay, so this is a question about being able to generate enough energy to supply the needs of this revolution that's going to happen in the future. Okay, so could we start with yourself, do you think?
Power generation is a political decision. It's got nothing to do with the industry, unfortunately. So whether we have more nuclear power stations or power generation is completely down to the politicians, and they're not very good at it. There's been a massive amount of hysteria in the press that we need 11 new nukes to power electric vehicles. You can't have a shower, you can't boil a kettle. A lot of it is quite rubbish, and National Grid had to produce a disclaimer, a mythbuster around this. We've got about 30 years to solve the problem. It's not next week's problem. Within 30 years, we will come up with some solutions. If we do absolutely nothing, we may need some power generation. But there's an obsession in this country that everybody goes home and plugs in at 5 o'clock at night. If everybody took their petrol car to the petrol station and filled up at 5 o'clock at night, the petrol grid would collapse. I've had an electric car for nearly 5 years. I never plug in at 5 o'clock at night because my mileage doesn't require it. And by the time we get to the point, if we have cars with 300-mile range, we won't plug in at 5 o'clock at night. You plug in when you need to plug in. So there's a lot of hysteria around it, but the bottom line is power generation in this country is a political decision.
So the current population of EVs in the UK at the moment is sort of 130,000. You do some maths on that, that works out at about 0.1% of our electricity use today. So at the moment it barely registers on the graph. If you converted all of the vehicles on the road today, all the passenger vehicles and similar vehicles on the road today to EV, the forecast is that the sums work out at about an 11% energy increase on today. So over 25 years, we're going to, for transportation in the sort of passenger domain, we're going to add on 11% to the electricity consumption of the UK as compared to current figures. But the other thing to think about from a transmission and distribution of energy point of view, over the last 10 years in this country, our electricity use has actually fallen by about 10%. So we have actually got extra capacity on our transmission and distribution system today that we didn't have 10 years ago. So we've certainly got a clear path from the point of view of the grid, the actual power grid, and getting the energy around the country for certainly 10 or 15 years. And the forecasts are that if we get smart charging in use successfully, so that people are encouraged through pricing signals to charge the car in the middle of the night, for example, that there'll be almost no reinforcement of the transmission system and distribution system for maybe 18, 20 years, something like that. So from a transmission and distribution point of view, there's plenty of capacity already there, and there will be upgraded necessary in time, but we've got, as Colin said, we've got 25, 30 years to make this very gradual transition to electrify transport. And from a generation point of view, as I say, there are the basic sums show that it's about 10 or 11% increase on electricity compared to today over a long period of time. That's a very slow ramp up. And our energy system is used to change the whole time. As population grows, as we build more factories and more houses, the mix of energy use around the country and the amount of energy used changes all the time. A national grid are continually modelling and forecasting for what energy use will be for the next 25, 30 years, 40 years. So that's all factored into the investment decisions that are made in the long term in terms of generation capacity.
I think from my point of view, I wouldn't talk so much at a national level in terms of absolute generation, because I think that's a misleading argument. I would certainly talk much more around the impact of clustering EVs in certain geographical areas. That's probably where you're going to see the greatest sort of challenge. But even in that sort of environment, you're ignoring potentially the potential of having the EV connected to the grid as a positive rather than just a negative. So if you do have sort of smart metering, new technologies coming on board to try and incentivize when people charge and they don't charge their vehicles, and you include the option to sort of store energy locally or generate energy locally, either through the domestic energy storage or the battery systems on the vehicle, and accessing that through sort of vehicle to grid type systems. I don't see it being a problem in the longer term, but I think it is much more of a challenge around the localized clustering of demands rather than the absolute demand reflected to a national level.
Points that James and Mark have both made are very valid. I think eventually we could have a problem if we don't do anything about it, but this is exactly why there is research going on to explore how we can develop technology that allows us to smartly manage this and also understand user behaviour as well. And what we haven't mentioned yet as well, excuse me, is that with increasing battery sizes, at the moment we might have, depending on your usage behaviour, you might have to plug in every day because batteries on vehicles aren't comparable to normal petrol or diesel vehicles at the moment. That is true on the whole. But with battery and sizes increasing, we will see by I think about 2025 that we start seeing a comparison. And actually, if you think about how often you're fueling your car with petrol, there really isn't. You don't worry about the fact that you've got to go to the petrol station that often. At least I don't anyway, because my mileage isn't enough. So when we actually start thinking about that battery being a huge storage asset, we can actually then start thinking about how we can use it in other ways, and it provides flexibility to the grid and actually is a benefit where we can charge it at the time that suits us and discharge it if we need to as well, and potentially make some money from that as well.
Okay, it's down to me to disagree. So energy and power are two completely different things. 10%, 11%, I think in Germany the figure is 5% of how much more energy needs to be created if we go fully EV. Power is completely different. The average household can take 10 kilowatts out of the grid. The average EV today could take 50 kilowatts. If you charge it slowly, maybe 3. Is there enough spare in the average house to give 3 or 6, something like that, kilowatts? It's a bit of an issue. The whole thing about is there going to be a disaster, though, I do completely agree. There isn't. This is self-regulating. Once it gets to the point where problems start to appear, companies such as ours and others that deal with battery storage, which is the answer here, because we've got an energy grid which is increasingly volatile. The sources are dependent on the wind and the sun, and the power generation doesn't occur at the time when people want to use it. There's also limitations on what's called smart, because smart really is focused on the provider rather than the receiver. For me, smart would be, as a consumer, that it is available when I want it. But that's not the meaning of smart today. Smart means when the grid would like to provide it. So I think there is quite a problem, but I think that there are some tremendous ways through, and they have to do with storage and localized delivery. There's probably one other thing I should say, that there's a guy who's really worth listening to, Professor Tony Sieber in the States, who talks about the cost of transmission and the cost of generation. When the cost of transmission and the cost of generation become on a par, what's the point in central generation? So there's going to be some other things coming on as the cost of generation falls with renewables, which is happening. There's going to be a lot more localized generation, and that actually is going to solve some of these problems.
Did you have another
Could I
point?
just support that local generation? Nissan up in my end of the woods has just put 11 megawatts of their own generation in through wind and solar. So what you're going to get is an awful lot of places around the country doing this as well. And the sum of all of this will have a major impact. And the other thing is, I was quite surprised to see in my local patch as well, we've now got the Gateshead Power Company that built their own power generation plant. So you've now got local authorities generating power as well as the big power generators. So as you said there, in the next 30 years, there's going to be a lot of power generation, which is not centralized power generation. The trick for the grid is to keep the frequency working the right way. And actually, electric vehicles can help that.
So in summary then, I think there will be a lot of changes to the grid because of the way electricity is generated renewably, more distributed, and that electric vehicles are not necessarily a cause of a problem. They could well be the solution to many of the problems associated, especially if you look at the huge amount of energy that can be stored in that battery network. Oh,
Can I just add one?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, also to say that the network operators have been looking at this really very actively for 6 or 7 years, running trials of EVs, monitoring behaviour of users, understanding the effect on local substations and so on. And that was all in an environment where no one really knew whether EVs were going to become a success story. And of course, in the last few months, certainly in the last 6 months, it's switched from being will they ever be a success story to being how quickly will it succeed and how quickly will that transition happen. So there's a lot of really good work by some very sound engineers to actually understand and work out problems that might occur and what solutions they could bring in to try and mitigate some of those problems if they do occur.
okay. Thank you very much, panel. I think we can move on to the second question now, which is from Phil Underwood.
Hi there. So Phil Underwood from the Society of the Environment. The question, so the Society of the Environment is concerned about the negative environmental impacts of batteries. So there's a few questions attached to this. How are the batteries used in electric vehicles becoming more sustainable? For example, where does the waste go? Where do battery components come from? What can be reused out of batteries? And is the technology moving fast enough for the developments of EVs?
Okay, so can we start with, I think we've all got some expertise in batteries here, but start with James.
So I think it's fair to say that when you manufacture batteries, the embedded energy that goes into manufacturing a battery pack, an electric vehicle, will exceed that of an internal combustion engine. It depends very much on the environment where the manufacturing is made, but generally you could be looking at maybe sort of twice as much as the embedded CO2. Once the vehicle is in use, so you get that in-phase CO2 usage, as long as that vehicle is in use for 2 to 3 years, and again it does depend on the country where the vehicle is in use and the grid mix associated which goes into producing the electricity, then you will start to see a net benefit from having that sort of vehicle in use. Once you then go beyond that, and let's say the battery pack lives for the life of the vehicle, so that's 7 or 8 years, if not longer, then you start opening up opportunities for sort of second life applications, and pretty much all of the main automotive OEMs and a lot of the sort of grid providers and small SMEs are now starting to look at sort of second life battery applications. So it's not really just a question of the traditional manufacture materials recycling. You also have to sort of play in the whole sort of waste hierarchy and a circular economy aspects. And when you do that and you look at sort of remanufacturing and repurposing, rather than simply recycling, and over the total life of the battery pack in the vehicle, then arguably they are becoming much more sustainable. There are things that can be done. It's fair to say that the first generation of battery systems were probably focused more on first life targets of power density and energy density, but all of the OEMs and the systems integrators are becoming much more aware and much more attuned to circular economy aspects and maintenance and warranty aspects, and now quite a lot of the battery packs have quite sophisticated designs and electronics to enable remanufacturing, repurposing. So yeah, they are getting much better.
Rebecca?
I have to say, batteries aren't my area of expertise, but but what I would say is that to kind of echo James' point, that this kind of cradle to grave use of the battery is absolutely imperative to making sure that we are not having actually a detrimental impact on something that's supposedly meant to be environmentally better than petrol and diesel, and actually ends up being worse. So there's quite a lot of research that's gone into looking at the manufacture, the whole life cycle process of it, so the manufacture of even the charge points as well. And then again, depending on where your electricity is supplied from, your marginal emissions factor of the grid, that's also really important. But for me, and that's one of the things I think that we need to really start getting better at and understanding a lot more, is what the second life EV process will be. So how we actually can turn these battery packs into something useful sounds really simple in practice, but isn't. And that, I think that to me is something that's really, really important. Unless we can get that right and make sure that we're actually doing that in the best way, then electric vehicles really become actually no better than petrol or diesel potentially. That's what I would say on that.
I thought. Tim?
So batteries are getting better. The battery management systems in vehicles are stunningly good. They're very clever. I mean, I don't know how fully up to speed everybody in the audience is, but time has way gone past when it's the charging device that decides what happens. It's the car. And the car decides what happens in order to protect itself. And it's actually reached quite an advanced stage. Companies such as Nissan would tell you that they're actually slightly surprised at how good the life, and Tesla would too, how good the life has become. So 100,000 mile vehicles that still have a very high proportion of their original battery capacity is not uncommon. What to me is interesting is that there's a wholesale move at the moment towards equipping these battery electric vehicles with the kind of range that we all are used to with diesels and petrols. And what we're going to be doing there, if we're not careful, is building a fleet of vehicles that have completely underutilized batteries, because on average, believe it or not, we do 26 miles per day. And yet we all want 300 to 600 miles in our cars. So there's actually a danger of these brilliantly conceived, highly developed batteries never actually getting run in.
Do you have any?
Like Becky, I'm not a battery specialist either, but I think there's a tremendous opportunity in the reuse and repurposing of batteries after their useful life in a vehicle. Average car you see on the roads today, the lifetime is sort of 12 years maybe. You don't see many cars on the road that are more than 12 years old. An EV that's got to that sort of age will certainly have a battery that certainly won't be giving a tremendous mileage in terms of the range of the vehicle, but it will be a battery that's still got some really useful capacity in it for use in other applications, such as fixed storage, for use in third world applications, of course. And I think there's a real great opportunity there for a supply chain to develop, to characterize second-hand batteries, repackage them, reformat them and market them in different applications, and provide, tremendous resources in terms of battery capacity at relatively low cost. And, potentially batteries could be lasting 15, 20, 25 years if they're managed in the right way over their lifetime, as the expertise to support them develops. But in terms of the volume that we're going to get on the market of used EV batteries, we're still 4 or 5 years away before there's any real volume, because obviously EVs in terms of volume sales of new cars have still been very small over the last few years, and it's now picking up fantastically. But in terms of waiting for those to come through the product life cycle, the earliest Leafs are 7 years old now. So there'll be a trickle. There is a trickle coming through now, but it's very small numbers. So we've got 4 or 5 years really to grasp the nettle in this sector and really take advantage of them as an opportunity.
Typically, vehicle manufacturers say that the battery is no longer usable after it's got 80% capacity left in it, which means that basically 20% of the battery's been used and the capacity is reduced by that much, which is still a huge amount of energy. And we're saying that they're not suitable for vehicle use. Think of all the other hundreds of applications you could use that for potentially, bearing in mind your house is typically about 5 kilowatt hours a day consumption. We're talking about batteries of like 25 kilowatt hours.
The car manufacturers are also genuinely surprised about how robust these batteries are. I've got a 4-year-old Leaf, it's done 45,000 miles, and I think it's probably lost maybe 6, 7, 8% of its capacity in terms of range. That's pretty good, really. So I think that they are genuinely very surprised. And of course, the battery technology is only going to get better and better. There's a huge amount of R&D going on worldwide into battery technology in terms of energy density, weight density, life of it. So we just had to fast forward a few years and think 10 or 15 years' time, people won't be having conversations about durability, age, range. It'll all be very historic because the technology will have moved on so rapidly during that transition process.
Stop being defensive on this. I came down on the train, I got off at Coventry, I waded through diesel taxis to get to the bus station to get on a diesel bus. It stunk. Whenever I get off at King's Cross, it stinks. I'm breathing it, right? On LinkedIn, I get people talking about cancer, slaves for children, the amount of CO2, building an engine compared to a battery, what type of dumper truck picked up the lithium, the whole lot. I think we need to get off the defensive thing and say this quite simply. If you want an alternative, there's consequences. We've got years to solve them. Lithium ion, people go on about the cobalt, the nickel. We'll design it out, it'll be somebody else. The reason we're not recycling batteries is because there's none to recycle. You've all got a lithium ion battery in your phone, you've all got one in your laptop. Funnily enough, that's not a problem. As soon as we've got a lithium ion battery in a car, it's a problem. I think we have to make a decision, as we always do, how do we want our power generated, and how do we want our joy in our life, which is our car, if we have one, to drive around. If I go into a garage and switch my engine on and shut the door, I come out alive. If I do that with a diesel, I die. Right? We can manage the emissions from however we make the power, but we have to get real and decide what we want. And I think we've spent too much time being on the defensive.
Well,
I wish you'd speak your mind.
yes.
There's always one on the panel got to do it. It's me.
I do have a partially electric vehicle, a hybrid, which is halfway in between, and I've had it for nearly 15 years now, and the battery is still working perfectly. So I don't see that this is going to be a major problem going forward. Okay, we'll move on to the next question now, because I think we spent a long time on that. And this is from Malgoz. Let me start that again. I'm going to get your name right. Malgorzata Wojtala. Yes.
Hi, I'm a student of the University of Warwick, and in terms of inductive charging, what are current expectations or projections of the industry about the IPT, it is inductive power transfer? So it seems that Korea is investing significantly now in IPT, but it doesn't seem to be the same trend for Europe. So is it because of the efficiency issues, misalignment problems, or is it not economically valuable? Or is it the slow speed of charging?
The questions there. It's longer than the questions I've got on this card here. Okay, I hope you managed to acquire that. Could we start at the far end there?
So a little bit about inductive charging. The basics of inductive charging are to do with surface area. So there is a problem with a car because the surface area underneath the car is not very big. And discounting all of the physics that takes you to the final result, for a car, it's going to be quite difficult today or in 50 years' time to get more than about 20 kilowatts. For a bus, it's completely different. And one of the lovely things about inductive charging, of course, is that there's no intervention. So bus stop charging starts as the bus is slowing down to a halt automatically. You can have a 3-minute stop, bus stop, and you've got 3 minutes of charging. You couldn't possibly do a charge with a bus stop if it was conductive charging. So be careful about talking about efficiency, because there's all kinds of forms of efficiency. Efficiency of use and generation is one thing, but actually whether it works, whether it delivers something that couldn't be done another way is quite interesting. Why are we not as far advanced as we are in Korea? I'm sorry, I couldn't answer you. I think it's got a great future. And 20 kilowatts isn't bad. Because there's one other thing here that a favourite phrase of mine at the moment is lies, damn lies and EVs. 50 kilowatts is the so-called rapid charging standard. It isn't 50 kilowatts. If you look when you're charging a battery electric vehicle like a Nissan Leaf, at the actual power, it's nowhere near 50 kilowatts. And it peaks at something a lot less, let's not get into the numbers, and then it drops like a stone. If you actually have 20 kilowatts of charging, it's not 20 versus 50 in terms of time. It's not going to take twice as long. 20 kilowatts isn't a bad figure. So inductive charging has probably a brighter future than a lot of people currently see.
Okay, Rebecca, this is your area.
I would agree with that. I really like inductive charging because of the fact that there's a lack of intervention. Like, there could be alternative solutions such as automatic clamping down on the charger, for example. But in terms of the not having to do anything, that appeals to me from a personal point of view so much. If it's raining, I do not want to be plugging in an electric car in a car park. I just won't want to do it. I will just leave it. Frankly, and I can imagine that a lot of people probably feel the same. So again, don't know why we don't have more of it. I think it's probably a technology thing. It will be an efficiency thing as well, because there is an efficiency loss. But I completely agree with your point that there are cases where we probably have to have it. There was a study that was trying to be implemented in the UK for road inductive charging. But the infrastructure cost for that, to get a moving vehicle along a road to be charging at the same time, was incredible. So I think that particular solution may not happen anytime soon. But I really like inductive charging. I think other people have a different view, and that it's the efficiency loss and the fact that you have to kind of be exactly over the right point, so actually parking is an issue. But as soon as we have autonomous vehicles, again, that parking issue probably becomes a null point as well.
Okay, James.
Yeah. Pretty much said similar things. So as far as I'm aware, is that there is an inductive charging trial for buses down in Bletchley, where they're actually trialling some new bus stop style inductive charging. For me, one of the issues that I'm most acutely aware of, I guess, is the human interaction to it. So we've done studies and research here looking at how well or how poorly people park, and from the research that sort of we did, only 5% of people managed to park the vehicle consistently such that the inductive plates were actually properly aligned in intolerance. So when you take into account that human intervention and then you couple it with the natural efficiencies or inefficiencies that you're going to get through the inductive sort of coupling, then it becomes less attractive. You can see it being a technology that might be niche for certain manufacturers. So certain manufacturers of premium vehicles, you could see this being the sort of premium add-on that someone that spends £100,000 or more on their vehicle, doesn't particularly want to charge it up with a cable. So it's the sort of thing that you might see in a very high-end premium vehicle with that cascade down into the consumer vehicles, maybe over time. But I think the real opportunity, perhaps, is when we start moving into to more autonomous vehicles where the actual control of the parking is linked to maybe the location of the inductive pads. And we're already beginning to see that, not so much in autonomous vehicles that go on the road, but where we have sort of pods being used around Heathrow and other contained environments where they're beginning to look at how sort of inductive charging and rapid charging can be linked with the autonomous software that controls the actual operation and energy management of the pod as a whole.
Okay.
So we're on a long journey here, which is a fascinating journey because it brings together lots of different unusual ingredients that never had to work before. And one of the key ones, of course, is the automotive manufacturers themselves and getting them on board, as well as all of the other the sort of dynamics of the system in terms of the players. Of course, they have to see value in wireless charging if they're going to really back it, because ultimately this will add cost and weight to a vehicle. On the infrastructure side, if you want inductive charging in supermarket car parks, that's going to increase the cost of investment of the hardware. You've got to dig the ground up to put pads in and so on. So I think in time, as you say, I think market forces will drive some of the premium car manufacturers to perhaps offer it, but there'll still always be a cable option as well, because they'll still have to provide that, because some people will want that as well. I do think there are some niche applications, for example, taxis and taxi ranks could be perfect for it. You've got taxis queuing up outside a railway station. You could have very, very easily perhaps have pads every sort of 1 car length at intervals along there, and that would make really good sense actually in that sort of application. And that might be a way of sort of proving the value. And of course, there, as you say, the parking, which is one of my personal pet hates is bad parking, is something that is an issue until autonomous vehicles can really take over and park a car exactly where it needs to be for it to work for wireless charging.
Any thoughts?
Dynamic's not going to happen, and static will come on premium cars and they'll test it out and it will charge a fortune for it.
So it's a technology which is definitely viable technically,
Yes.
but whether the market will actually bear that out.
You can buy a kit now for a Nissan Leaf to do it, but it's about £2,000
And you've got to carry around your conventional charging
as well.
hardware as well at the same time.
Yeah.
So it just adds to the weight and therefore the performance of the vehicle.
And you've got to modify your Leaf and invalidate the insurance as well,
So
and the warranty.
although it sounds like a great idea, I mean, it's got some limitations, hasn't it?
Today, though.
That's
Yeah.
today.
That's today.
And
Yeah.
the idea of getting on the motorway and having your vehicle charged as it's moving along, that's certainly got a lot of appeal to it. Okay, thank you very much. We'll move on to the next question to the panel, which is from Ganesh.
Hello, my name is Ganesh Kirlal. Work as a automotive engineer with AVL Powertrain. I'm not sure this question is relevant anymore because it follows on from with linked to the last question. So recently learned from a training that the induction charging unit or wireless charging units has an efficiency of between 60 and 90%. So I was thinking, up to 40% energy loss, especially if the energy has been produced from non-renewable sources and transmitted, and then to lose up to 40%, I thought was quite a lot given the current scenarios. I understand that in the longer term, if everything is from non-renewable, then we can afford to lose some of those. But if the energy is actually being produced from a diesel power plant, then indirectly we are still not really offsetting carbon.
Okay, so the question is about the efficiency of inductive charging. Do we have any quick answers to address this
I
one?
wrote down on the train your question, yes.
Yes is the answer.
Yes. Completely agree with you.
Any other comment?
That's all I wrote, yeah.
I think if you've got something that's got a loss of 10, 15, 20%, your car's going to take longer to charge. It's going to cost you more. So you've got a natural market force there in terms of an effect on you as a user. So that's potentially a barrier to an inefficient charging system. Because the EV users will want an efficient, rapid charging arrangement. So I think there's a natural, those natural flaws in wireless charging, particularly if you get the alignment wrong, create a barrier to the attractiveness to an end user. So if I said to you, would you tolerate an extra 10% on the cost of the fuel for your petrol diesel car because of an inefficiency in the pump, then you'd say no to that.
Why isn't the government currently stepping in and regulating the use of it? So I know that a number of OEMs are actively looking into wireless charging, particularly premium ones. So this is like, I see it as an equivalent of someone being able to put a V12 petrol engine or something without being regulated. So this looked to me as if it's totally unregulated, so the government is not questioning the application. So my question was partly whether government should be stepping in and saying, till we get a certain level of efficiency, shouldn't we?
Steps in and regulates. It's the last thing they ever want to do. And with the current type of government, it's just the last thing.
Sure, we don't want regulations that stifle innovation. This has potential. It has potential in particular areas. The case example that I gave about a bus, it's actually the difference between it being able to be done and not being able to be done. So please, let's not go down a route that could stifle innovation. If we can increase the efficiency to the point where we're up at 90% because of autonomous vehicle control and so on, then is 10% so bad? What's the efficiency of vehicles we drive today? What's the efficiency of a hydrogen vehicle? I mean, we are talking about minor losses compared to massive losses. And if there's a countervailing argument, it's worth looking at for specific applications. But can I add to the previous point? Please, let's not go down the idea of putting stuff under roads that you have to drive down. That was cloud cuckoo land.
So the next question's from Mike Wallacott on behalf of Greenwatt Technology.
Thank you, and good evening, panel. Mike Wallacott, Greenwatt Technology. We're actually electric vehicle transition consultants. So our job is to really kind of make hearts and minds and bring about the change to electric vehicles. We've been driving electric vehicles for 5 years, just over 5 years now. Interesting, Mark and I often play this game at these events, but we actually usually ask how many people in the room actually are driving vehicles, electric vehicles, and we know there's always 2. At least. And then also we asked the question, how many think there will be driving electric vehicles in 5 years' time? And 5 years ago, I remember vividly asking this question, and we had 2 hands up in an audience of about just over 60 or 70. And how many intended to be in 5 years' time? Don't forget this was 5 years ago. We had more than 50%. So I don't know, Mr. Dimbleby, whether you'd be prepared to actually have a head count there for later on to see what happens. But the question then is related to uptake. Given the rapid growth in innovation and funding now being given to stimulate the transition to electric vehicles, especially here at Warwick, of course, in vehicles, charging infrastructure and back office systems, should fleet managers and small business owners act now or wait?
Before we ask the panel the questions, let's have that show of hands. Could you raise your hand if you own or drive an electric vehicle? Okay. So
Your EV.
yeah, pure EV. I was going to ask a subsidiary question. So what was that, about 10, 12 people of 100, 10 to 12%? So this is quite a high percentage in this particular audience. Does anybody drive a hybrid vehicle? I do. So that's probably only 4%. So there's far more people in this audience, not surprisingly, I guess, that drive electric vehicles. So the uptake is quite high here. So we move on to Mike's question now.
I do what you do. I advise people on what to do, what to take up. And one of the things I say is read the smoke signals. If you live in one of the 5 cities which are going to produce 0 emission zones, and you've got a diesel van, you can't take it in. But the problem is there are no other diesel vans. So there is ENV 200, there's a Renault Kangoo, and above that it's hit and miss. It really is not a lot, and above that you're struggling. So for fleet managers, it's an interesting question. And the other point is that, in the chat we had recently, is that there is a finite limit to the number of EVs available. So if 15% of the people in here and the population went out to buy an EV, there'd be none left. Because despite all the hype and the messages from all the car companies, they're not putting any volume down. So one of the problems we're going to hit pretty soon is we're going to have an awful lot of infrastructure, which is not used a lot, and not many EVs, because apart from Nissan and Renault, nobody's making them in Europe. So Volkswagen, everybody makes a lot of noise, but if you can show me a plant which has got a capacity of 200,000 or 300,000 EVs to tip the balance, I'd like to see it, because they're not doing it. So there is a finite number of batteries, there's a finite number of cars. So if I was giving advice to a fleet company, I would say, if your business and your customer is saying you need it, you'll have to go and get it. But if you're driving 3.5 tonners, I wouldn't quite know what you would use.
I mean, obviously, for the heavier vehicle types, there are very few options. There are, as you say, limited options in terms of vans. But obviously, in terms of passenger fleets, there are a lot of cars out there. If you go to a website called Next Green Car, you'll find lists of plug-in hybrids, pure battery EV. In terms of the fleet operators and whether they should take advantage of that, look at that. It's very circumstance dependent, of course, in terms of the fleets and what their usages are of those vehicles. But I do know there's a lot of activity in this area. I met a company the other day that's providing finance to fleets to help them get into EVs with charging as part of the deal, and they're doing lots of business. So I think there are fleet operators out there who have confidence in the technology. They don't worry about the technology. Maybe they've got an EV themselves. So I think we're on a slow climb of people who actually recognise they work really well and they are very predictable to use. And if you've got the right sorts of profile of how you use your vehicle, even with today's cars, that it makes good sense. There's a company in Cornwall who are a taxi company, and they use only EV taxis, Leaf taxis, and they're saving £8,000–9,000 a year on fuel and running costs in that particular application.
It's very context specific. It's not something you can generalise, but I think key probably to your question is the term fleet, because if you're buying the vehicle within the context of a fleet operation, then I suspect one of your main drivers will be economic, which is generally quite different to how consumers buy vehicles, where there's still much more an emotive or passionate sort of element to it. And if you look at total cost of ownership of a vehicle, it is still largely dominated by two factors, one being depreciation and one being sort of fuel cost. For the data that we have currently, which is not great because the vehicles have not been in the market for that long, the battery powered vehicles or hybrids tend to depreciate more, so you'll hit harder on that, but then your fuel costs are that much lower. So overall, total cost of ownership for an EV can be lower. If you factor in that, where you might be operating the vehicle within a very urbanised environment and therefore not paying congestion charging and that sort of thing, then anything that can help to bring down this total cost of ownership for a fleet operator, I suspect will help drive the decision towards sort of EVs. But it is very context specific. If you're using the vehicle and you're doing lots of mileage on a motorway going up and down, then arguably a sort of well-tuned sort of diesel vehicle van is still probably the best for you.
There are two things that would play a factor in whether a fleet, again, emphasis on the word fleet, would want to switch. And the primary one is cost, total cost of ownership, and the other one is whether they actually, their drive cycle, their usage, their behaviour with the vehicle, actually it means that they could use an electric vehicle, and whether if they have to change the way that they use their fleet to be able to accommodate the vehicle, whether it's worth it from a cost perspective. So actually, quite cynically, it is primarily down to cost. And as Colin said, a big factor in that is whether there are going to be low emission zone charges, because that can make about £2,000 at least difference a year if fleets are going into a city every day. It can basically be the deciding factor on whether it's worth it for a fleet or not. Yeah.
Be able to use
Yeah. If you can't even go in the city without being a no emission, then it's no brainer. You have to then start finding different ways, and if that means you have to change the way that you use your vehicle, then that's what they have to do. So I say that cost is completely the most important thing for them.
Cars, not really a problem, and you can get decent range cars. Small vans, there are some around. The little Nissan van, we have one on our fleet. It's a fabulous vehicle. I mean, let's not beat about the bush. We haven't even talked about this. Driving that little Nissan ENV 200 is better than most family cars. It's gorgeous. It's quiet. It's light to drive. It's easy to drive. It's got all of the functionality and the features. So long as you don't need to do more than 60 miles a day, it's fine. And by the way, most of us do half that. So if it's viable, a whole load of other things start to come in. It's never off the road. It doesn't go wrong. When it does go in for service, it costs virtually nothing, because when you take your foot off the accelerator, you're not wearing down the brakes, you're slowing down the car and putting energy back in. All this background stuff is actually terribly important. So they're more viable than you kind of think, so long as you've passed that binary question, whether you can achieve the range. The other thing to bear in mind there is you're talking fleets. So you're talking about business vehicles. And with a business vehicle, increasingly, you've got to think about rapid charging. And that is, we haven't even really got into that, but that's the big bugbear. The reason that the Nissan Taxi project, which I ran, fell over was there are no rapid chargers. I'm exaggerating. London, I think, currently has about 40. Milton Keynes has got about 50.
I wouldn't necessarily agree with the fact that we need rapid chargers, though, because it really, really depends on the use case. I agree that taxis, for example, primary, their utilisation is so high that having a rapid charger is pretty much the only option unless there are extenuating circumstances. But for a council fleet, for example, they are likely to be operating 8 a.m. till 4 p.m. every day, and possibly not at the weekend. So then a city-based fleet still doesn't need rapid charging. So I would agree that certain operational cycles definitely would, but that isn't a limiting factor for a lot of fleets.
A bit of food for thought on a different one. In a fleet car, you can't smoke a cigarette for your health, right? Wait for the litigation coming of the driver who's got health problems, and he will ask the question, could you have provided that person with a safe working environment? And the answer is yes, and you can't use cost as a defense. There's a lady in Paris suing the French authorities, aerobic teacher, and she's saying she can't do her job because of the emissions that she took in going to work. A traffic warden, a policeman's place of work is on the streets, and people who drive vans, diesel vans, their place of work is the van. It's quite ironic. You can't smoke a cigarette, but you can breathe in diesel fumes. I think litigation is going to push this, and it will come. Somebody will test it. It'll be thrown out. It'll be tested. It'll be thrown out, and somebody will win it. And that's what's going to tip.
Certainly, as a keen runner, I hate the diesel fuel emissions. It's dreadful.
Different point, just to put one metric into the room, because we haven't really talked about it, the real-world range of EVs on the market today, the new Leaf, which has just come out, a real-world range of 140, 150 miles. That's not a claim, that is what you will get for average driving with the Leaf that's just been launched. And the other perception is that these things are very expensive. Again, the new Leaf, you'll be able to buy that on a PCP deal, brand new, for $300 a month, something like that.
So, I was just going to throw in potentially whether we even need to think about, from a fleet point of view, whether we even think about buying a vehicle or not. We're seeing generally the sort of servitization of functions, and there are a number of business models out there where you don't purchase the vehicle, you purchase a certain amount of mileage, or you purchase a certain number of journey hours, and you use that to de-risk the whole issues which you might feel you have about buying what to your business might be a new technology. So whether or not there's a tipping point between buying EVs and not buying EVs, it might be that people aren't purchasing the vehicle as such. They are purchasing a service, and the means of getting that is an EV which is managed and maintained by another organisation.
Thank you, panel. We'll move on to the penultimate question from Mike Lane. Mike?
Mike Lane from WMG. At a conference last October, Professor Doran Orbach, big name in lithium-ion battery research, got up and stated fast charging is a waste of time, the cells cannot cope. Does the panel agree or disagree?
So this question leads on nicely from some of the comments that were attached to the last question. So who wants to start?
I'd say waiting for a long charge is a waste of time. So if it's working today or not working today, it had better work, because we are clearly all going EV. So we just have to do this. The man's wrong.
My Nissan Leaf handbook has a guarantee of 100,000 miles regardless of how I charge it.
So they believe that it isn't an issue.
So I don't think it's an issue either. One thing we have in our favour is the climate we have in the UK. Batteries don't like heat. So if you're putting a rapid charge into a car, you're generating heat in the battery. So I think we have an advantage here compared to some countries. But there are some case studies of cars, anecdotal perhaps. There's a taxi company I mentioned in Cornwall. One of their cars recently it got to the 100,000 mile mark. And they reckon it had done 1,700 rapid charges during that 100,000 miles. And it hadn't lost any of the bars, if you like, on the battery meter in the car, which sort of is a sort of state of health of the battery. So that's a pretty strong story. And there's also an anecdote of a guy in America who was followed on Twitter and YouTube for a long time, who for 100,000 miles, he only drove his Leaf to and from work, and he had to rapid charge on the way to work, and he had to rapid charge on his way home from work. And that was in a hot environment in the US, and I think he lost 1 bar out of the 10 bars. So he was really punishing it pretty hard. And the other thing is the Nissan guys, when I talk to them about this issue, they are really surprised and impressed themselves at how good they are.
So working in a university, it's not going to come as a great surprise if I say that all research is not wasted. So to limit the charging technology or the research simply because of current battery technologies implies things move more in a linear fashion than they do. So I think, if we throw the research out there and we look at multiple things at the same time, then we never know quite which one's going to go forward. And it might be, we develop the charging technology before the battery technology. All of a sudden, someone makes a breakthrough in battery technology, and then we have two systems that we can put together. So just to say that because because we have a limitation in one area now, shouldn't necessarily impact what we're doing in a research perspective in a other area that might be complementary. So no, I wouldn't actually agree with that.
I would just say they might be right, but what does it matter really? If we need to rapid charge and manufacturers are warranting the vehicle, and when we say 100,000 miles, if that means that they've got 80% left of the battery capacity, then does it really matter? If it's not, as long as we're not blowing up vehicles, then really, I think that we probably need to take that maybe with a pinch of salt.
I think the Nissan people are more concerned, if you like, about cars sat with batteries full for long periods of time. That's actually not a very happy situation for a battery to be in. And also, if you're driving it below 10%, particularly if you're driving it hard below 10%, that's not particularly good for the battery either. So those sort of circumstances are quite different, but they're the ones that are actually probably more damaging than and rapid charging.
It's really quite interesting here. We've all got these, and we all go from 10, 20, 30% up to 80 or 90%. Do we all wait till it's 100%? Because it takes just as long for that last little bit. It's the same with the car. When I was talking earlier about the kilowatt power into the vehicle, it is dependent upon the state of charge. And that's done on purpose. It protects the battery. And it actually disincentivizes you from getting that last little bit in.
The worst thing you can do is not the rapid charging, is to drive 10 miles to work, 10 miles back and plug it in at 5 o'clock. Because your car will be between 95 and 100% full all of the time, which is another reason why we won't all be plugging in at 5 o'clock at night, because we'll kill the battery.
Okay, so it seems like rapid charging isn't dead, and it certainly will be demanded by the users of electric vehicles. So we have one last question. It's more of an economic question from Mark Tor. Mark around? From a famous electric vehicle company, I think.
Good evening, everyone. Hello, so my name is Mark, and I'm from a small electric energy storage company or energy technology company in Palo Alto, California. So my question is more to do with energy storage and disintermediation. Are we witnessing a tipping point as battery capacity continues to approach the $100 per kilowatt hour mark? As inflationary pressures raise the cost of heavily subsidized oil exploration, extraction, refinery, and petrochemical distribution, whilst arguably renewables, particularly solar PV projects, are experiencing an inverse deflationary scenario.
Okay. Who wants to start with this one then, about cost? Start at this end and go along, shall we?
The answer on the tipping point with regard to the cost is obviously making the EVs a lot more viable. But there's an interesting thing on the battery storage, and what I look at is that you need batteries for battery storage, and we haven't got enough batteries for the cars. And it's all down to the world's capacity of how many cells we can make. And if you look at how many cells we can make in the world, and the Chinese are making 80% of them, the rest is left, and the number of cells determine how many batteries you get, and how many batteries determine how many cars. So we're getting this great conundrum in my brain, is whether or not you want to use the batteries for energy storage, or you want to use the batteries for the cars. And you can't have both, because there's not enough battery cells and there's not enough battery capacity. So the market has got to sort itself out on what it actually wants. Personally, I think we need to put them in the cars, because if we put them in the cars, we solve the emissions. But the energy storage market is taking off, and everybody wants to build, and as the local authorities just put in 3 megawatts of storage, and all I see is lost battery cells that could have went into a car. So the tipping point is quite interesting on the price, but there's a tipping point, and I'll do a little balance on the train for this one, of car versus storage. What's the priority?
You can use I would say the vehicle, because you put it in the vehicle and you can use it for storage as well. Whereas if you put it in storage, you can't use it to drive around. So I would say that there is a tipping point, and I think that your point about the fact that there is a EV versus storage, if you put it in your vehicle, then for 90% of the time, you're probably not going to be using your vehicle. Again, that's a generalisation. There will be people that do use their vehicle most of the time. There'll be people like me who some days doesn't even get in their car. So actually putting them in the vehicle means we can use it for both. And if we aggregate all of these different vehicles together, you have gigawatts by 2050 of power, of storage power available, capacity rather, to deliver that storage requirement, power requirement.
The cost of storage is coming down, but one of the things that has been driving the cost of storage coming down isn't just technology, it's the investment in large-scale manufacturing processes for the technology because of EVs. So EVs have been very, very influential in driving the cost down of storage, which of course is reducing the cost of storage for fixed applications as well. So I think that's a very exciting position. I do think we're at a tipping point. I've been in the energy business now, in the energy sector for 7 years, and And for the first 5 or 6 years, there'd be many, many events and conferences about storage. Will storage ever succeed? What are the barriers to it? When will it be cost effective? The last 6 months, 12 months in particular, I've felt a real change in terms of there are now end applications where it's becoming sustainable in its own right as a business model. And there are investors now investing in storage, both at the end use and in the primary sort of manufacture and the technology that goes into making them. So I think we are at a tipping point absolutely on batteries, and I think it's a self-fulfilling scenario. And if you look at graphs of the costs of PV, photovoltaic panels and how that's come down over the years, battery storage is on the same sort of Moore's law type of curve. So it can only be very positive, and there is investment going into facilities to increase capacity because everyone sees it is going to happen now, particularly on the EV domain.
So in your question, you talked about sort of $100 per kilowatt hour. So at that level, I assume you're talking about cell level costs, because still at pack level, when you aggregate these things into actually useful systems, we're still currently at around sort of $300, $350 per kilowatt hour. Our roadmap, if it's true, won't get us to pack level costs of $100 per kilowatt hour till about 2030. Currently in the UK, in terms of vehicles, I think we're registered about 140,000 sort of EVs are currently registered, which is about sort of 3 to 4% of UK fleet, which has slowly been going up in absolute value. That's obviously still quite small, but I guess one of the things that you do sometimes look at is you look at those sort of technology adoption type sort of bell curves, and arguably we are at the point between sort of innovators and early adopters, and generally when you switch over from one to the other, then you might see a rapid growth. So I think, so what you have in a question is a cell level cost, not a pack level cost. So for it to be useful as a system, it's going to be 2 to 3 times that. But arguably, yeah, we are at the point in the curve where potentially, if everything else comes into play, so we get the supply, the security of supply, we get all the other government pressures and legislations and all those things that are there to be a carrot or a stick, then we could see us going up that curve, which has a much sharper gradient than we've been seeing over the last sort of 4 or 5 years.
I'd like to make the point that the tipping point is not just about the price per kilowatt hour of the cells. It's the price of the vehicle, and we're in danger of producing vehicle after vehicle. Take the Nissan Leaf as an interesting example, that went from 23 kilowatt hours to 30 kilowatt hours to 40, and strong rumours it's going to 60. That sort of growth over a 7 or 8 year period is typical of the industry. It's terribly important for this industry that we get it right and we don't overshoot it. Otherwise, all this rare battery stuff is going to be sitting there in vehicles doing very little other than giving us the confidence that we can go anywhere, wherever. So, what's a long journey? How many people will do a couple of 100 miles without actually being quite prepared to stop for a couple of hours? These are not questions that are the same every year. They change as we think through these things, and we've never had to face these things before, but actually, we've always done it. When you have a 600-mile range in your diesel BMW 5 Series, do you drive down all the way down to the south of France? Actually, that's rather further than that. But do you do the whole thing in one go anyway? No. So we've got to think very carefully about getting the right balance of the amount of energy that we carry and not overpricing the vehicle and ending up pushing ourselves back under the tipping point that makes the vehicle no longer competitive.
Mentioning that batteries is not the only cost factor in an electric vehicle, which needs to come down, and there are other things as well. But the battery is the one that most people worry about, but it's not the only one.
I think you lose the plot again on the price of an EV. I don't think it's got anything whatsoever to do with the price of an EV, as you will see by the amount of Tesla orders that they've got, and they're not cheap. It's all about, as people prepare to change their lifestyle, That's what it's about. Forget about the price of the car. On PCP, they're about the same. But what you've got to do is to change the way you live. And if you go, as I do, one day around a few schools and see the cars that are dropping the kids off, the Audis, the BMWs, etc., the Leaf pales into insignificance on cost. I seriously don't believe it's a cost factor at all. You can go and buy a Zoe, you can buy a Tesla. There's a whole plethora of them. Not many of them, but there's a plethora of them. And cost is an excuse. It just is. I'm sorry. I've had one for nearly 5 years. I very rarely use a rapid charger. It costs me about 70 quid a year for fuel. It's your ability to change your lifestyle and get used to doing something different is the barrier.
Okay, would anybody else like to add anything else? Okay, there is we have finished it a little bit earlier. If anybody has got any burning questions that we haven't covered, now's the time. Well, let's go to this man here who was desperate to ask one earlier on, and then we'll come to you, young lady.
Hi, thank you. My question is regarding, well, so far most of the discussion is centered around CO2 impact of electric vehicles, but most of the cancer-causing emissions that come out from the cars that are going around is NOx. Has there been any discussion about NOx impact coming from electric vehicles, particularly from well to wheel? More importantly, the question is even more significant because there's only so many windmills or solar powered stations that you can build around a city. Since you guys reckon we are going to have diversified power generation. So do we fall back into fossil fuel powered power generation, and what's the final NOx impact that we're going to have that's potentially going to cause cancer?
Interesting question there about emissions. And are electric vehicles going to have the same emissions as internal combustion engines?
Yeah, I would say that actually last year the focus perhaps was the government focus was on your CO2. Now it's all about air quality. We are absolutely, the focus is on air quality. I think actually we probably need to make the focus on air quality, and the carbon emissions almost need to come as not a secondary thought, but they need to be thought about after, in a way, because air quality is 75,000 deaths a year are caused in the UK as a result of poor air quality, primarily due to tailpipe emissions. That's a huge amount, and that figure varies from year to year as people estimate differently, but that's, one is still too many. And one of the primary goals of electric vehicles, and the reason why we have all of these clean air zones now coming into force in the UK over the next few years in cities, is to address this NOx particulate issue. In terms of the wider well-to-wheel and tank-to-wheel, so well-to-wheel is where we dig up the coal, or how we power the generators to then generate electricity that we then feed into the vehicle. And then the tank-to-wheel is what emissions there are out of a vehicle. So for electric vehicles, tank-to-wheel is 0. And well-to-wheel is, I can't remember the exact amount.
Well, what I can say on that is that our energy last year, more than half of it was from renewable sources, either nuclear or primarily offshore and PV. And the bulk of the rest was actually gas. So in terms of emissions overall, well-to-wheel is something like 2/3. I'm not an expert in this area, but looking at the stuff I was reading the other day, just ahead of today, so it's something like 2/3 in terms of the overall efficiency, compared to a car, which is about 1/3 in terms of operating efficiency. So the perception is that EVs are powered by coal-fired power stations. Last year, all the numbers aren't in yet. Last year, it looks like coal was about 5%. Last year for the UK, so it really is on the out.
And there were days last year when
there was none.
There was no,
yeah.
Nothing burnt to produce electricity.
This trend is only decreasing in terms of the CO2. It's almost something we don't necessarily need to worry about in terms of electric vehicles anymore, because of the fact that there is so much momentum going for reducing CO2 in the electricity grid as a whole. There's actually an app you can get on your phone now that shows you what the emission factor is every half-hour period, I think, throughout the day of the grid. And it's really interesting to compare that to 30 years ago, because it's so much lower. And as we keep on getting distributed generation onto the system as well, that well-to-wheel emission will just keep on reducing. And if we add that to the fact that we're already saying we're going to wipe out that NOx emission from vehicles, then we're really onto a winner with it.
Got any points to make on?
You don't have to worry about the wind turbines in your city, because we've got them all up north. Don't worry about it. They're all in the sea.
But their efficiency is improving dramatically. Their cost is improving.
The point you're making on NOx and PM is absolutely right. They're the nasties that we need to tackle, but it's all about electricity generation, I'm afraid. And there's a brilliant YouTube video on Fully Charged about how much electricity is used to refine petroleum. It's massive. So we use a lot of dirty electricity to make a dirty fuel, which we stick into a car and we burn it, right? That's nuts. At least if it's a dirty generation of electricity, it just goes in the car, if it's an electric one. So you cut out the second burning of the dirty fuel. So what's being said here is right. Coal-fired power stations will be gone very soon. We won't have any. The interesting thing is what will replace them. Is it all going to be wind turbines? And if I have a look at our old shipyards, I think it will be, because they're absolutely full making these things. And I was amazed to see there's 5 just gone out, and they're 8 megawatts a piece. One turbine, and they're going to put 900, etc. So you're right, it is about what's in. But the problem we have, as I experienced when I came out of Coventry Station, is it is in pockets in the city, and that's what we've got to get rid of.
If you Google, look for offshore wind farms and look to where they are and the plans to roll out further offshore wind, there's a staggering amount out there. It's obviously out of sight, so it's out of mind. People aren't aware of how much resource there is there. I think we hit 10 gigawatts peak output the other day from wind for the first time. That's a record. So there's an enormous amount of wind resources around the UK. We're very lucky to have a very shallow continental shelf and have so much of it that's ours. So compared to the rest of Europe, we're in a very, very good place from that point of view.
Killjoy, you can't decide when the wind's going to blow. So we do have to
At least
aggregate.
it blows all of the time.
Very
I
good
can
answer,
guarantee
Colin.
it.
Okay. You ask any sailor, there's always a lot of wind in the North Sea.
Okay, is there any more
doesn't
points to
shine
make
there
on
at
that question?
Everybody, if we've got one form of energy supply, that we talk about the last 5 to 10 years, tidal. Tidal can produce 20% of our electricity. It's always there. If the tides stop going in and out, we can forget about electricity. 14 hours of electricity supply for nothing.
Yes, that is true. There's huge amounts of tidal as well, there's huge amounts of tidal energy available, and it's just a matter of making it economical. That's all it is. Okay, can we ask a question over here? And then I think we're just about out of time.
I'd just like to challenge Colin really on his question about the economics and that it's down to a choice and changing our behaviour, which also ties into a question we've received on the Energy GRP Twitter feed. Does the need for a garage or a driveway for home charging put EVs out of reach for anyone but the rich? So if you think of how a number of people within the UK actually live within terraced houses, don't have a place to park their vehicle, might park it several streets from where they live, how will the infrastructure need to change? And is that something that is accessible for your average person?
At the moment, you don't charge your petrol car at your house. But we assume everybody has a right to charge an electrical car at their house. Strange assumption. I don't know who created it, but there we are. Shell's announced its first EV petrol station, right? So we're going to be building the equivalent of EV petrol stations around the country, which will have a lot of superchargers. So I'm currently contract managing 300 kilowatt chargers going in. So we started at 3, then we went to 7, then we went to 22, then we went to 50. We're now putting 150 to 300 kilowatt chargers. And we will slowly replace petrol stations with the EV version. So if you live in a terraced house or you live in a 7th floor flat, you'll fill up at the petrol station. Will be an electric one. So I'm not quite sure why we have this assumption that we will charge at home.
Which is why one of my colleagues said to me the other day that, if you notice, petrol stations are getting more and more cafes in them, so that it gives you something to do while your car's charging up.
Just on that, surveys have shown that 60 to 65% of homes have got off-street parking. So obviously for approximately 2/3 of the population, they've got the ability and the provision to do so if they obviously put a charging point in. And as Colin was saying, rapid charging networks are going to be much more common than they are today. They will gradually replace filling stations that you're familiar with today. And the other flexibility, of course, is to be able to charge at work, which there are schemes now to encourage employers to put charging in car parks for employees. And places of leisure and retail outlets are places that are known to be very attractive for charging for EV users. And that will come too.
Okay, James?
The only thing I would add, which could have social implications, I guess, is we all know where we want to get to in terms of EV ownership and rapid chargers, etc. It's that transition phase where one might come before the other. We want to make sure that during that period, that could be 3, 4, 5, 10 years, that certain people aren't disadvantaged.
I would actually challenge the vehicle ownership model in response to that question completely. So at the moment, typically, I myself own a car. My partner owns a car. You will have a car. You might have 2 cars or 3 cars per household. But I use my car very, very little, very, very small amounts. So really, we could have, in terms of mileage, we could have 1 car and still not use it very much. So why do we even own those 2 cars? Why not have a car club scheme where there is a car available for me to pop in, drive to work or drive wherever I'm going, drive back, and that's it. And then where the vehicle is located, they deal with the charging, and that's the end of it. And when we start getting autonomous vehicles, that really, really flips that model on its head completely, potentially. Because then the vehicle turns up, and then you use it wherever you want to go, and then it goes off again and charges wherever there is charge points available. And actually, that means that we can then start really managing the way that the electricity network is loaded. So then we start saying, okay, well, there's problems on my street, for example, in 10 years' time, every single household's got a car, so therefore the electric vehicle, therefore the load's doubled, the network can't cope. And actually, autonomous vehicles mean that we can just move that load and put it somewhere else. So potentially that is, we're completely changing the way that we even think about vehicle ownership, and actually homes don't even own vehicles, it's all outsourced.
Taking that to its logical conclusion, it would actually mean that there would be less vehicles on the road.
Yeah, potentially. Well,
because most vehicles at the moment are sat in car parks or on drives, not doing anything most of the time.
Interesting reflection on that, because that is clearly going to happen, whether it takes 1, 5, 10 years. It's that model we're moving towards that. I don't think Colin's in agreement by the look of things, but pretty much the rest of the world is. Now, it's quite an interesting point that autonomy and electric vehicles are absolutely wedded. The reliability and the longevity of electric vehicles makes it practical to talk about autonomous vehicles that could do 3 or 4 times the mileage, that could be busy for 70 or 80% rather than 10 or 20% of the time. You try and do that with a petrol or a diesel vehicle, the repair costs, the off-road time, nightmare, impossible. So EVs have a little bit more to do than just clean up the roads. They will actually make this autonomous world possible.
Colin, did you want to come back on that one? Because you were...
One thing that people seem to forget is just about everybody buys a car because they like to drive the car. And people buy Ferraris, they buy Aston Martins, etc. It's quite interesting because I do a lot of correspondence with Americans. They all own a gun. They don't need a gun, but they want a gun. And a gun kills people, but they won't give up the gun. Driving silly kills people, but they still want to drive the car. As I get older, I like making decisions and I use my cognitive brain to drive it, or I could sit in the back and become a cabbage. I don't see fully autonomous vehicles happening. Maybe I'm just a grumpy old man. I just don't think it's going to happen. I drive around the Lake District. I meet sheep. I meet all sorts of things. I don't know what autonomous cars are going to do. But one thing is for certain, is that it will be an awful long time before this population is 100% electric vehicles. We're talking about 2050, 2060. I'm sorry, we're that far out.
There's a lot of technology that needs to be developed and put in place before that can happen, but it doesn't mean it's not going to happen. And I think these luxury cars, like you were talking about, they're the ones that people like to drive around in. It's going to be like horses today. People still own horses, people still ride horses, but you don't need them.
It'd be interesting when an autonomous car meets a horse on a country lane.
Okay, is it a quick one?
Yes, it is.
Okay, this is the last question.
During the 1970s, I was working with, not for, a company called Fluoride Technical Services, which were based in Manchester. Okay. Thank you. That's better. Now, this company was experimenting with a battery called a sodium-sulfur battery. It was reputed to be a lot cheaper to make because sodium is cheap and sulfur is cheap. It had a much better performance than the current lead-acid batteries. The only problem was it wouldn't work below a certain temperature. Does anybody know what happened to the technology? Was it embodied in anything else, or did it just die?
Okay, that's a different sort of technology to what's being developed now.
We've done a lot of work with some sodium-related batteries, and the heat thing is the problem. We actually built a project around some vehicles that use sodium batteries, and one of the reasons it fell apart was that unless you kept the vehicle charged over the weekend, when you come back to it on Monday morning, it's flat. So it has limitations. The plus side is that sodium-based batteries are fully recyclable. It could be said that that's a good thing.
So has it died?
Not yet.
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else got any thoughts on that one? Yeah, okay. So thank you very much for your questions, those of you who asked questions. I'd like to thank the panel. So thank you very much, panel, for your wonderful insight. I'm sure everybody appreciated that. Please, if you do have any more questions, I'm sure they're not going to rush straight out of the door at the end of this, so you've still got a chance to ask some questions. But I've just got one notice to make before we finally wrap up. There was a competition which was held with the students at the university here to make a video to reflect some aspect of energy usage, and the panel here have looked at those videos and come up with a winner, which you can probably see later on outside. This should be being displayed on the television screens out there. So congratulations to, I think they're here, to Jonathan Sard and Isabel Curtis. Are they here? Yeah, well done to you too. They're the winners of the Energy GRP Video Challenge for 2018. And your video was on vehicle-to-grid technology, and it was judged by the panel here as being a thorough examination of the concepts involved. So well done. You will get a prize for this. I'm not entirely sure how that will be got to you, but you will get a prize for this, and congratulations. So thank you very much for everybody who's come along tonight. It's been a very successful event. The place is full. I've never seen this so full, so I hope you've enjoyed it, and certainly I have. So have a safe journey home in your 14% electric vehicles. Well done.